In 1919, World War I was described as the war to end all wars. But as we all know, it didn't turn out that way. The Second World War started in Europe only 20 years later. The causes of the Second World War were various, but there can be little doubt that some of the roots lay in the Treaty of Versailles. The participants in those negotiations were trying to come to grips with a wide range of issues in the wake of a devastating war, but there were different egos at work, different agendas, and often conflicting aims. There were also prickly personalities and concepts of national sovereignty which played powerful roles in the whole drama. Now, the events of this talk occurred 100 years ago, but while I talk, I invite you to keep in the back of your mind the circumstances of today, as nations and prickly leaders attempt to hammer out international agreements on how to move forward with issues that are often beyond the capacity of a single nation to resolve. Issues such as climate change, trade, nuclear proliferation, and pandemic disease. And in finding agreement, just how much national sovereignty has to be given up if multilateral accords, such as NAFTA trade agreement or the Paris Accord, and organizations such as NATO or the EU or the UN are to work successfully. In negotiations, what prices have to be paid, and are the costs of success or failure worth the outcome? So at 11 o'clock on the morning of the 11th day of the 11th hour, the 11th month in 1918, the guns of World War I fell silent. At the request of Germany, an armistice had been agreed, but it was only an armistice, a temporary ceasefire and renewable every 36 days, while arrangements were made to negotiate a formal end to the war. These negotiations began as the Paris Peace Conference in January 1919, and the result was the Treaty of Versailles that was signed on the 28th of June, just 100 years ago, in a few days' time. The formal peace process, however, continued and did not end until 1923, by which time there had been 5 more treaties dealing with unfinished territorial claims and counterclaims. By 1923, this is how Europe looked. Germany had lost territory, Alsace-Lorraine to France, Schleswig to Denmark, part of Prussia to Poland. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had been dismembered completely. Czechoslovakia had been created. Romania had been virtually doubled in size. Yugoslavia had been invented. And the borders of Poland and the Baltic states, that is, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, had been set, but of course were to change and change again as the 20th century unfolded. Now, before describing the negotiations and the terms of the treaty, it is important to set the scene. The numbers of dead and wounded far exceeded any from previous wars. Estimates vary, ranging from 7 to 8 million military combat-related deaths, plus another 2 or 3 million deaths by accidents, disease, and deaths while prisoner of war. Here are some examples of the military deaths. See, Russia, 2 million. France, 1.3 million. Germany, also 2 million. And add to these the military deaths of other participating countries, plus some 5 million civilian deaths, and the total came to between 15 and 19 million. And in addition, the war also left some 22 million wounded. And here are some photographs of the battlefields in France and Belgium. And this is just one of the French cemeteries. That's just one of the French cemeteries. So it's not surprising, therefore, that when the negotiations began, emotions were running high. Overwhelming relief at the end of the slaughter, tempered in some quarters by a thirst for revenge and a feeling that the aggressors, those who had started the war, they had to pay. Oh yes, they had to pay. From the outset, it was obvious to the French that the venue for the peace conference should be Paris. Paris in 1919 was the intellectual, cultural, and fashionable centre of the world. In Western Europe, France and Belgium were the countries that had been attacked by Germany, and many villages, farms, and fields were now a waste of mud, shattered bodies, and the mangled weapons of war. The Americans and the British wanted somewhere neutral, but the French were having none of that. No, Paris it had to be. As for the participants, some were equally obvious: France, Britain, America, and their allies, large and small. Delegations from 32 countries took part. But as for other combatants, there had been great changes. The monarchies of Germany and Austro-Hungary no longer existed, and the Tsar and his family in Russia had been swept away by Bolshevik revolution, and the Ottoman Empire had also collapsed. Eastern Europe was in confusion and disorder, and as far as stable government authorities were concerned, there was no there. It was abundantly clear that the negotiations would provide a unique opportunity to redraw the map of Central and Eastern Europe. But these were not to be the negotiations between the warring parties. To the self-regarded victors came the spoils. No, the negotiations were between the victors alone, to redraw the map of Europe, to divide amongst themselves the colonial possessions of the losers, and to decide how to build Europe for a lasting peace, so they thought, for the 20th century. There were no Germans at the negotiating table. And when in May 1919, the terms of the treaty were conveyed to a German delegation, which was given only 2 weeks to offer comments, they were surprised and shocked by the content, as I shall illustrate later. Who then were the peacemakers? As so often in politics, personalities play a very significant part. The leaders of France, Great Britain, and the United States were known as the Big Three. France was led by Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, a crusty curmudgeon with a reputation for fierce political infighting. In his young life, he'd been a journalist sharply critical of governments he didn't approve. And at the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, he'd been the mayor of Montmartre, the district in Paris, and had strongly opposed the peace treaty with Germany that had transferred Alsace-Lorraine to Germany. He'd risen to become Prime Minister of France from 1906 to 1909, and then again in November 1917. And his great rival, French President Raymond Poincaré, once said of Clemenceau that he was a man of catastrophes. If he couldn't prevent them, he would provoke them. Prime Minister Lord George of Great Britain came from coal mining Wales, and he strongly supported the cause of the working man. With a Welsh gift of oratory, the sharp elbows of a political infighter, and a deep belief in patriotism, he'd risen in political circles. Like Clemenceau, he'd also made political enemies among conservatives who often accused him of having more mistresses than principals. Despite his distaste for war, he objected to the strong dominating the weak by military force. Thus, when Germany invaded Belgium in 1914, he recognized that Britain had no option but to fight. He became Minister of Munitions in 1915 and Prime Minister of the coalition government in December 1916. Woodrow Wilson was a quite different kettle of fish. Aged 62 in January 1919, 6 feet in height, academic, former president of Princeton University, former governor of New Jersey, and president of the United States from 1913 to 1921. By nature, an aloof man, sometimes nicknamed the schoolmaster in politics. He was a high-minded idealist in pursuit of democracy and world peace. With little knowledge of foreign policy, initially he wanted to keep the United States out of the war in Europe. But after the disclosure of the Zimmermann telegram and the declaration by Germany of unrestricted submarine warfare in early 1917, he'd concluded that the country could no longer remain neutral. In April 1917, he had asked Congress for a declaration of war on Germany. America's participation in the war was to last only 20 months. But America's contribution of fresh men and munitions was actually the key that unlocked the conflict. Now, in January 1918, Wilson had gone to Congress to present his famous 14 points as a statement of principles for peace in negotiations to end the war. And as I think you can see them there, the main themes were open covenants of peace, no secret under-the-counter deals. Just imagine how naive he was, huh? Guarantees of reductions in national armaments, resolution of colonial claims, proposals for the settlement of a number of territorial issues on the basis of self-determination, and the establishment of a general association of nations to keep the peace and make agreements on political independence and territorial integrity. And this last, of course, was to become the League of Nations. In early 1918, the reactions to the 14 points had been mixed. Abroad, Germany, early 1918, was already feeling the weight of the war, and the end of the Treaty of Litovsk had meant that there was no Eastern Front, and therefore they felt that they were being squeezed by the American munitions and more troops. And they were seeing more and more American soldiers arrive in Europe, so they began tentatively to see Wilson's approach as a possible lifebelt to end the war. Hard-bitten Clemenceau and Lloyd George, however, were more doubtful, and, surprise, surprise, in some respects rather cynical. Britain cautiously welcomed Wilson's ideas, but resisted anything that might threaten the British naval superiority, and also wanted Germany to make reparation payments. Clemenceau was markedly less enthused by Wilson's idealistic 14 proposals, and he said caustically, "Le bon Dieu soi-même n'en avait que 10. The good Lord himself had only 10. At home in USA, Theodore Roosevelt wrote an article in which he said, quote, "If the League of Nations is built on a document as high-sounding and as meaningless as the speech in which Mr. Wilson laid down his 14 points, it will simply add one more scrap of paper to the diplomatic waste paper basket." The Big Three dominated the Paris Peace Conference, but they were not alone. Italy felt that it deserved a place at the high table, as it too had declared war on Austro-Hungary in May 1915. That's 10 months after the start of the war. Italy's Prime Minister, Vittorio Orlando, styled himself as the Premier of Victory. But Britain and France felt that Italy had offered its services to both sides before deciding which side to join. And so Lloyd George and Clemenceau regarded Orlando as a lightweight. And then there were the generals. The Allied Supreme Commander was the French Marshal Ferdinand Foch, a pragmatic soldier who wanted to keep politicians away from a soldier's business. In the months before the armistice, he had developed vigorous terms calling for the Germans to evacuate all territory they had taken since 1870, including Alsace-Lorraine, and to allow 3 Allied bridgeheads over the Rhine River to facilitate an invasion of Germany should it become necessary. And in this regard, he disagreed with American General Pershing, who was all for an invasion in order to force Germany into an unconditional surrender. Once the peace conference began, the Big Three all kept their generals at arm's length. Clemenceau cheerfully took the position that if the armistice was indeed an agreement between soldiers, then a peace treaty was the business of politicians. And during the conference, the military officers tried to warn the politicians of errors they were making. But Wilson scarcely spoke more than 5 times to his military advisor, General Tasker Bliss, and Lord George consulted his military advisors even less. And as if this mixture of backgrounds and attitudes and egos was not enough, there were also the Japanese. In the early years of the 20th century, Westerners were largely mystified by Japan. Was Japan a major power or not? Japan had achieved a major defeat of the Tsarist Russian Navy at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, and since then had energetically developed its economy, its exports, its shipbuilding, and its military capabilities. While it had declared war on Germany in 1914, largely because of interests in the Shantung province of China and some small islands in the Pacific, it had otherwise kept its attentions on Korea and China, and Japan's contribution to the war in Europe had actually been minimal. And below Oriental blandness, as elder statesman Yamagata had once commented, quote, "It's extremely important to take steps to prevent the establishment of a white alliance against the yellow peoples." In the devastated areas of the Western Front, all of which were in France and Belgium, and outside Germany, the war did not take place on German territory at all. There were miles of destruction and the detritus of war. Among the mangled guns in France and Belgium, there were deserted trenches, destroyed villages, and many human corpses. And together with losses of cattle and sheep, over 8 million horses were killed in the war, plus countless mules and donkeys as well. Now, on the Eastern Front, between Germany and Russia, the Tsar had been forced to abdicate by a revolution in March 1917. The provisional government itself was replaced by the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917, led by Lenin, and he knew that war against Germany had to stop if his communist revolution was going to succeed. Russian troops had mutinied, and the war between Russia and the Central Powers of Germany and Austro-Hungary ended with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. And the terms imposed by Germany were very harsh. Russia had to recognize the independence of Georgia and Finland and give up Poland, and the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia to Germany, and Ukraine had to be given to Austro-Hungary. In all, Russia lost some 1 million square miles of its former territory, some 55 million people, and the majority of its coal, oil, and iron resources. But this had left Germany and Eastern Europe in political ferment. So Bolshevik Russia was not invited to take part in the peace conference either. And after all, how far was this Bolshevik revolution going to spread? Inside Germany, the population was suffering much hardship. The British fleet had successfully blockaded the northern ports, stopping supplies of food and other war supplies. For example, saltpeter, which Germany needed for its ammunition and shells, had all to be imported from Chile, and the British fleet was stopping it getting through. Violent uprisings as the Bolshevik movement grew contributed to discontent within Germany. And then eventually the confused situation led to the forced abdication of the Kaiser in early November 1918. That was just following the mutiny of the High Seas Navy in Wilhelmshaven and Kiel at the end of October. German losses at the front had been significantly underreported by the government. Moreover, as I've said, the fighting was not on German soil, and as the conflict had not included extensive aerial bombing of cities and populations as it was to happen 25 years later, the German public didn't believe that they'd lost the war. And with the Kaiser gone, why had the government of the new Weimar Republic actually sued for an armistice? And inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there was also massive confusion. The duality of the Habsburg monarchy, with two parliaments, one in Vienna and the other in Budapest, had been strained from the beginning of the war. Emperor Franz Joseph had died in November 1916 at the grand age of 86. And the Bolshevik Revolution of November 1917 and the Wilsonian peace pronouncements encouraged socialism on the one hand and nationalism on the other, or alternatively a combination of both tendencies amongst the varied nationalities of the peoples of the Habsburg monarchy. So from all these factors, it can be seen that when the high-level representatives of 32 countries gathered together in Paris in January 1919 in an atmosphere of diplomatic courtesy, political bonhomie, and mutual relief at the end of the war, just below the surface, there were at the same time many different agendas, priorities, and lurking concerns. And all three were sourced by the egos of the Big Three. So what then were the aims of the Big Three, and how did they differ? President Wilson was the idealist and supporter of self-determination for ethnic communities in Europe. But incidentally, he was not in favor of self-determination for non-whites in Africa and elsewhere, because he thought them incapable of governing themselves. By his 14 points, he projected a vision of ending war forever with the creation of the League of Nations, which would exist, he thought, to find peaceful solutions to crises. It would encourage disarmament, improve living standards, and make the world a better place. And in his view, Germany should not be made to carry all the blame for the war. Clemenceau, however, with over 1 million French dead in the field and eastern villages and farms devastated by battle, had a quite different view. Germany must be punished. Germany must pay. Germany must return Alsace-Lorraine. Germany west of the River Rhine must be demilitarized and independent. And France, having faced the Prussian army at Waterloo, in the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, having lost again in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, and having been faced with the German invasion yet again in 1914, must have the German army disbanded so that there could never be another attack. And as for the League of Nations, ridiculous, unrealistic, fanciful nonsense. Lord George, conscious of Britain's relationship with America, and yet also keenly aware of the human and other costs of the war, took a middle road. Britain, as a trading nation and as an empire, was always interested in expanding its influence overseas, and in that regard, it was very keen to maintain naval supremacy. It was important to have a Germany that would be economically strong enough to trade, and yet Lord George also had to mollify those in Britain who wanted to make Germany pay. In London, in a remark that has echoed down the years, British politician Sir Eric Geddes had said, "The Germans are going to pay every penny. They're going to be squeezed as a lemon is squeezed until the pips squeak." The range of issues before the Paris Peace Conference was vast, and there were several commissions and committees and subcommittees of diplomats, bureaucrats and advisors formed to deal with them. There was Baltic nationalism, Polish affairs, Russian affairs, the new states arising from the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, the Balkans, and then China, Japan with China and the Pacific. And of all these various items, in the short term of this talk, I intend to just focus on the League of Nations and on reparations for war damages, as it was the inadequacies of the League of Nations and the resentment caused by the latter, the reparations, that contributed, together with other factors, to the Second World War just 20 years later. Several ideas on how nations should work together to avoid war had been floating about before the war, World War I started in 1914. It was the war itself and Wilson's 14 points that led to the formation of the League of Nations. And on the 25th of January 1919, that's just 6 days from the opening of the Peace Conference, a formal commission was established in an atmosphere of ambition and anticipation. Little did the participants expect that following various disagreements and failures, the League would in practice cease to have any meaning by 1939. It was eventually dissolved altogether in 1946 by the establishment of the United Nations. President Wilson insisted on chairing the commission. As for him, the establishment of the League would provide an international mechanism capable of resolving disputes by diplomatically agreed peace settlements. And he was not alone in this ambition. Europe had changed considerably in recent decades. The nature of war had become more violent, with vastly greater human losses. Long-established monarchies had collapsed, and now, of course, there was the added factor of public opinion. A senior and well-respected British participant reflected many of his generation when he said, rather pompously, "There is about us the halo of some divine mission. We're bent on doing great, permanent, and noble things." But such sentiments could not hide the differences among the big three. Clemenceau remained a doubter at best, and was reported as saying in a dismissive way, "Well, I like the League, but I don't really believe in it." And Lord George was rather more forthcoming, but was he in fact a genuine supporter, or did he just feel that he had to keep America happy? Spirited discussions took place as the language was drafted. Was the League going to be a policeman or a clergyman? Should it have a capability to enforce its decisions or would moral suasion be sufficient? Was it going to be a sort of super-state, or just a club for heads of state and government? And come to that, what would be the qualifications for membership? And how would decisions be made? Would the League discussions be conducted openly or in confidence? And where would it meet, and how often? And throughout these considerations, there was the concern that lies under every multilateral international agreement: just how much national sovereignty would countries have to surrender in order to belong to the League and make it work? The Commission was composed of 19 members, with most of its authority held by representatives of 5, the British Empire, France, Italy, Japan, and the United States, and it met daily under Wilson's chairmanship. And drafting work proceeded rather quickly. By mid-February, so that's within 3 or 4 weeks of the start of the peace conference, a comprehensive draft covenant existed. But whereas Wilson chaired the Commission, neither Clemenceau nor Lord George personally ever attended the Commission's meetings. They were more concerned with the immediate problems of a shattered Europe than by contemplating what might or might not happen in the future. And in the Commission, the French fought to give the League military teeth, but Wilson thought in terms of economic sanctions and pursuing disarmament. As for decision-making in the League, the greater powers became concerned that the smaller powers might gather together and outvote them. And so there was a provision that League decisions had to be unanimous. Now, this proved to be one of the provisions for the League's ineffectiveness. And in turn, when the United Nations was established in 1945, the 5 powers insisted, in order to be members of it, that they be given the veto power, which is what happens today. The United States would not be a member of the United Nations Security Council if it didn't have the veto power. Other difficulties had to be overcome. Japan proposed a provision on racial equality, and arrangements were needed for the allocation of German colonies and the provinces of the collapsed Ottoman Empire. And then there was also the tricky matter of the Monroe Doctrine. Would acceptance of the League override this important component of American policy? In Washington, Senator Cabot Lodge was virulent on this point. Wilson, recognizing that inability to protect the Monroe Doctrine would lead inevitably to refusal of acceptance of the League by the US Senate, he had this clause specifically inserted into the draft, to the effect that nothing in the covenant would affect the validity of such regional understandings as this piece of American foreign policy. So on 28th of April, only 3 months from the start of the Commission's work, a plenary session of the peace conference approved the new covenant, which became the first 26 articles of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, this was a remarkably short time. The conference had only started in January, and so here you are, by the 28th of April, they'd already got a provisional agreement to the first 26 articles of the treaty. Wilson was well pleased with his achievement, but in focusing on this aspect, he allowed other issues of the peace conference to pass him by. And he also wrongly assumed that he'd done enough to sufficiently protect the League and American interests to gain the consent of the US Senate. And among all the matters before the peace conference aimed at reducing the power of Germany, setting the level of reparation payments was most important. A commission was formed of members from France, Great Britain, Italy, Belgium, the United States, Japan, and the future Yugoslavia. And the salaries of those commission members and their staffs and all their expenses, the bill was sent to Germany. Looking back from the distance of 100 years, it's easy to say that it would have been better if the victors had paid more attention to the recovery of Europe as a whole, rather than making Germany pay. But the human losses and the property destruction was just too recent, and the emotions were too bitter to permit such reasoned thinking. Of the big three, France and Britain, philosophically and financially, were in no position to pour large sums of money into the reconstruction of Europe. In the United States, sentiments were that Americans had already done enough on the battlefield to win the war. Why should America dig the Europeans out of the hole that they had dug for themselves? Perhaps it was later American recognition that more should have been done at the end of the First World War that led to the Marshall Plan that was so very successful at the end of the Second World War. So this commission wrestled with several problems. Germany and our allies, yes, indeed, they must pay, but just how much? Should reparations be set at a level to punish Germany for starting the war in the first place? How to calculate what Germany could afford? Were the reparations compensation for the damages and destruction? Or should they also cover the war costs of the victors? And how about pensions for widows and orphans? And how, and over what period, should reparations be paid? Yet again, France, Britain, and America had different views. The United States was primarily interested in getting the Europeans to pay back the money that they borrowed during the war. Britain owed the United States $4.7 billion, and France owed it $4 billion. And France also owed another $3 billion to Britain. France and Belgium, on whose territory the war in Western Europe had been fought, were faced with massive rebuilding and reconstruction costs. Together with Britain, the three countries had also incurred significant war costs, and so wild figures were put forward. In mid-February 1919, when Wilson returned to the United States for a short visit, the British were asking for $120 billion, the French for $220 billion, whereas American experts were recommending only $22 billion. And calculating what Germany and Austria could afford was guesswork. Germany couldn't provide reliable statistics as government finances were in such a mess. And during the war, in Germany, taxes had been kept low for political reasons, and war costs had been covered by war bonds and special notes. And in fact, the German plan had been that once Germany had won the war, it would recover the costs from the defeated enemy. For the Allies, if reparations were set too high, Germany would be unable to pay, but if they were set too low, the Allies would get too little, and Germany would not suffer what it deserved. The chief Treasury advisor on the British team was the noted economist John Maynard Keynes. And as the discussions went on, he became increasingly critical of the approaches of the Big Three. In his opinion, Wilson had allowed himself to be bamboozled by the British and the French. Clemenceau cared only for France, and Keynes had come to loathe him and what he saw as French greed. And as for Lord George, Keynes scathingly described him as, quote, the half-man, half-goat who'd come out of the mists of the Welsh mountains to entice the good and the gullible into the swamps. Keynes argued that the most Germany could pay would be $10 billion. Anything more would drive it to despair and probably revolution, with dangerous consequences for Europe's future. But Keynes' worries were just brushed aside, and unsurprisingly, he resigned from his position in disgust before the treaty was signed. And so, as the Commission worked on, into March and April, calculations were made. It was decided that eventually that the Commission should postpone its work until after the treaty was formally signed. And by the time the Commission set a final total of 132 billion gold marks, that at the time $34 billion, it was 1921. That $34 billion in 1921, in today's value, would be $510 billion, still a large amount of money. In March and April 1919, while the Covenant of the League of Nations was being drafted and delegates were wrestling with reparations, other matters were coming to a head. In addition to recovering Alsace-Lorraine, the French wanted neighboring Rhineland to be demilitarized and occupied by France. And there was also annexation of the Saar area, S-A-A-R, which abutted Alsace-Lorraine. Clemenceau argued that the Germans had destroyed French coalfields, and therefore France was entitled to have the Saar coalfields. Lord George cautioned about driving Germany into a corner. He said, quote, the greatest danger I see is that Germany may throw her lot in with Bolshevism and place her resources, her brains, her vast organizing power at the disposal of the revolutionary fanatics whose dream it is to conquer the world for Bolshevism by force of arms, unquote. Nevertheless, the blame for the war was thrown onto the Germans, and in came the guilt clause, Article 231 of the treaty. It stipulated that Germany and her allies had caused all the loss and damage. Germany was required to deliver to France 7 million tons of coal per year for 10 years. 8 million tons of coal to Belgium annually for the same period, and similar amounts to Italy. So on the 4th of May, the 444 clause of the treaty was sent off to the printers, and 2 days later, the Peace Conference held a plenary session to vote on it. Now, they'd only been negotiating since January, and to develop a treaty of this length and this complexity in only 3 months is really quite remarkable. But it's not surprising, therefore, that there were several misunderstandings along the way. They held a plenary session to vote on it, despite the fact that there was no printed version actually ready for them to see. And there continued to be rumbles, prescient of which, and to the irritation of Prime Minister Clemenceau, came from Marshal Foch. He continued to be unhappy about the Rhine arrangements. The next time, he said, the next time, remember, the Germans will make no mistake. They will break through into northern France and seize the Channel ports as a base of operations against England. And that's precisely what Hitler and his panzer divisions did 21 years later. In early May, a German delegation had been invited to Paris to be shown the terms for the first time. In receiving the delegation, the French did not miss the opportunity to grind their noses into the dust. The delegates were given the rooms in the same hotel used by French leaders in 1871, when they had had to negotiate peace with Bismarck. The German delegation arrived under heavy French escort. Their baggage was dumped into the hotel courtyard, and they were told to carry it up to their rooms themselves. The delegation had cautious but hopeful expectations. Germany had agreed to the armistice in November 1918, in the belief, as I'd said earlier, that Wilson's 14 points would provide them with a lifebelt, a basis for a treaty. And it would certainly have to pay some sort of indemnity, but not towards the cost of the war. Oh yes, Germany would become a member of the League of Nations, so the German delegation thought, and it would keep its colonies. German-speaking areas of Prussia and Silesia would of course remain German, and in Alsace-Lorraine, the predominant German parts would be allowed to vote on their future. Such was the hopeful, almost optimistic mood of the Germans on May the 6th. On May the 7th, the German delegation was given the text of the treaty and saw it for the first time. By May the 8th, a translated version was available, and as they read it, the members of the delegation were surprised, then shocked, then angry. Alsace-Lorraine, the Saar, Poland, Silesia, all the colonies, almost the whole merchant fleet, not allowed membership of the League of Nations, acceptance of an undecided amount of reparations that amounted to a German blank check. The irony that the terms were in several respects less harsh than those that Germany had imposed on Russia by the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk apparently escaped the German delegation. But they were shocked, they were angry. And when the news was shared in Germany, so was the shock. While Germany had not won the war, neither had it actually been defeated. Why should Germany lose 13% of its territory and more than 10% of its population? Why should it lose its colonies? Why should Germany alone be made to disarm? And Clause 231 of the treaty, the guilt clause, was particularly obnoxious. Why should Germany be the only country that had to take responsibility for the war? Most Germans still held that the outbreak of war had been a necessary defense against the outrages of the Slavs in Serbia in assassinating Archduke Franz Ferdinand. What sovereignty now did Germany have left? The Chancellor of the Weimar Republic declared that the treaty was unacceptable. Wilson, now, instead of being seen as Germany's savior, was now seen as a hypocrite. And when Wilson died in 1924, the German embassy in Washington, D.C. was the only embassy not to lower its flag in respect. Notwithstanding all these complaints, and as Germany had not been invited to the peace conference, Germany had no option but to accept. At a formal ceremony in the Hall of Mirrors, Palace of Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles was signed on June the 28th, 1919, the very anniversary of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand that had been the spark of the war. Wilson left to return to the United States the very next morning. The British delegation left by train as well, And then the British government was later much annoyed to receive a bill from the French for the train. The conference itself, with other matters to resolve, continued until January 1920, but the main phase was over. So then, what happened afterwards? How did the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations pan out? Here are some details of who gained what. And that's what Wilson got out of it, the League of Nations. And here is what Germany lost. That's a big list of territorial losses. And here are the physical list. Look at those. The physical reparations Germany had to pay as well as money. Horses, fillies, bulls, cows, sheep, to replace the losses of France and Belgium. That's a huge list. Is it any wonder that in Germany, the mood was one of resentment and revenge? Here are the trains loaded with industrial machinery being shipped out of Germany to France and Belgium. I never did like the old word. I'll put a P in front of reparations and see what comes up. On the night of signing, Paris became one giant party. But in the following days, Germany mourned, and flags flew at half-mast. The population still had no food, and other items were in short supply. Bolshevism was on the rise and being fought by nationalists. The latter blamed traitors at home, and the feeling grew that the army had been stabbed in the back by civilian traitors and the governing coalition that had signed the treaty. The Weimar Republic never recovered from this double burden. The discord and social unrest that continued through the 1920s became the kindling wood for what came later in the form of the rise of Hitler and its forceful reassertion of German national pride, power, and sovereignty. On the return of Wilson to the United States, he found himself in a fight in the Senate over the ratification of the treaty and the acceptance of the League of Nations. These are Senator Cabot Lodge on the right with the beard and Senator Borer on the left. Senator Cabot Lodge, who had never liked Wilson anyway, and others spoke strongly against acceptance, largely on the grounds of the surrender of sovereignty. Isolationists wanted no part of Europe's problems. Progressives felt that Wilson had betrayed his own 14 points. Irish Americans considered that he should have confronted the British with more vigor. And Republicans and Democrats distrusted each other. Sound familiar? In September, Wilson took the issues to the people by conducting a barnstorming train trip. But after 2 weeks, he had a stroke and the rest of the trip was cancelled. That's Senator Borer, and you can see the one in the center is Senator Cabot Lodge, refusing to give the Lady of Peace a seat. In November 1919, the Senate voted against the treaty, with Senators Lodge and Borer delivering the blistering speeches against it, charging, among other criticisms, unacceptable loss of sovereignty. The League of Nations met in Geneva with 42 founding members, and others joined later. A grand new building was constructed, which is now the Office of the United Nations in Geneva. But the United States was not a member of the League of Nations, nor was Germany until 1926, nor was the Soviet Union until 1934. Germany withdrew in 1933, and the Soviet Union was expelled in 1939 following its invasion of Finland. Japan was a founding member, but it too withdrew in 1933. And the League, with its requirement of unanimous voting and no enforcement capability, was unable to stop the outbreak of war in the 1930s. Recognized as a broken reed, it was formally drawn to a close and ended in 1946. And yet, even so, flawed though it was, the League was the first international organization whose principal mission was to maintain world peace, to try to get countries to talk together, to sit and negotiate. Following the Treaty of Versailles, there were 5 other treaties to deal with other associated matters as borders in Europe were redrawn. Turkey was reinvented, and the French and the British sliced and diced the remnants of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. In retrospect, the Treaty of Versailles has been criticized in some quarters as being unnecessarily vindictive, and it certainly caused deep resentment in Germany. The German homeland survived largely unscathed by the conflict. As I said before, none of the fighting took place on German territory. But the fact remains that Germany had in fact lost the war. It would inevitably have to pay a price. And part of that price 25 years later was the insistence by the victors that if they had another war, as they did in the Second World War, there had to be unconditional surrender imposed on the losers, on Germany and Japan. Now other questions linger. What if Archduke Franz Ferdinand had not been assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914? And that led to the unraveling of the start of the war. And also the monarchs of Germany, Russia, and Great Britain were all related. What might have been the outcome if they, as the monarchs of those 3 countries, had been able to act together to avoid their respective countries being swept into violent conflict? What might have happened if the United States had been as powerful after the First World War as it was after the Second, and had been willing to use that power? What if the negotiators in Paris, particularly the French and the British, had been significantly less demanding and more conscious of the impact of reparations and the charge of guilt on the German people? What if the League of Nations had actually been given enforcement powers? Important lessons were not learned at the end of World War I, but fortunately they were remembered at the end of World War II to make sure that the mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles were not repeated. The Marshall Plan, the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, NATO, and other multilateral institutions were established by the United States in concert with its allies. Dr. Joseph Joffe, the scholar and editor of the German magazine Die Zeit, put it this way, very tellingly: "The genius of American diplomacy in the second half of the 20th century was building institutions that would advance American interests by serving others." We're now embarked on the 21st century, and the present American administration seems to be bent on undermining those very institutions that have served us so well in the last 70 years. And an important question, therefore, is facing us. And this is why I asked you to keep this in mind, in the back of the mind while I was talking. How far should nationalism and national sovereignty be allowed to assert supremacy over multilateral relations and international agreements if countries are to find ways of working together and maintaining world order? This question hangs in the air today, just as it did 100 years ago. In 1919, the politicians thought they had the answer, but they got it wrong. So the question that is left hanging in the air is, have today's politicians learnt the lesson? Thank you. I don't know whether you have any questions under that. And yes, yeah.
Derek, if you look at the 23 map there, part of the French goal of creating Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia was to surround Germany with these big, powerful countries, which of course were big, but not necessarily so powerful. And it's interesting, and of course Czechoslovakia was referred to as the dagger penetrating Germany. It contained a number of Germans in the
Sudetenland.
Yes.
That northern part there, which Hitler later on, if you remember, took over Sudetenland because of the German, and that was the self-determination that Wilson was talking about. And Germany used the Wilsonian principle of self-determination of people with the same language as an excuse or a reason for invading Sudetenland. But at the same time, I think one can also take the point that Germany has the benefit and it has the strength and it has the weakness of being in the center of Europe. That is to say, whether it's bordered down there on the west side, its borders at the south, and its border to Poland and to Russia on the east, Germany always is much more conscious of its geographical position than France, who of course has a coast, and Britain is this little island off the northwest coast. But yes, there was that. And then of course poor Poland. I mean, everybody trampled over Poland in the next 50 years after that. And let me just touch on another. Yes, sorry, Ralph.
How did they enforce the reparations and the division, geographical division?
Well, as I say, there were several treaties between then and 1921. But for how did they force the reparations? Enforce the reparations? Well, of course, in fact, they didn't. In the end, Hitler, in fact, refused to pay them. And cancelled them in 1933. Of course, there were also agreements that Germany should not rearm, and Hitler went ahead and rearmed anyway. And because
weren't there changes made before Hitler came in?
No, they're not really. One has to remember that whether changes made before Hitler came in, one has to remember that what happened after 1921 was in the 1920s, the ferment continued. Germany, as you'll hear when Mark talks about the Weimar Republic, was torn asunder between the Bolshevists who wanted to wave the red flag and turn Germany to communist, and the nationalists, the right-wingers, who didn't want anything of the kind. And then, of course, the whole situation, even if the Weimar Republic had been able to rebuild, along came the collapse of the stock market, the Great Depression, and that too helped to create, as Mark I'm sure will describe in his talk, helped to create the circumstances for Hitler to rise. Yes, please. I'll come to you, Michael, in a minute. Yeah.
Considering all the lessons learned from both of these...
Sorry, could you speak up?
From all the lessons learned from these two world wars, what would you recommend to people in my generation and the current politicians? What do you think is the most important lesson to be reminded of such that this does not repeat itself?
Well, that's a $64,000 question. What would I think from the lady's generation to make sure things didn't repeat? My view is that, the world in 1925 reached the population of just under 2 billion, the whole global population. By the time the war ended and the United Nations began in 1945, the world population was 2.5 billion. We're now 7.5 billion. The world's carpet is wearing rather thin in places. And it seems to me, as I said right at the outset, that countries have to understand if they want to tackle the international problems, then they must be prepared to surrender some of their sovereignty. The signing of the Treaty of the United Nations, the Charter of the United Nations, when a country signs up to a treaty, inevitably it is going to have to surrender some of its sovereignty. Now, any government has got to be very careful just exactly how much sovereignty should it surrender. And the bigger the country, the more powerful the country, the richer the country, the name escapes me for a moment, there's even less willingness to actually make that surrender. But then what example does that set for everybody else? So fundamentally, my argument would be, and I'm giving a talk on the United Nations in September, and I shall return to this issue again, is that we actually all have to sort of remember the mistakes we've made in the past, and we have to work together. One cannot stand necessarily on national sovereignty is being absolutely primary. There has to be a certain give to actually make things work. And as I said, on climate change, on pandemic disease, on nuclear proliferation, countries have to work together. Who is Michael? Sorry, and I'll come over. Michael.
Yeah, one's a comment, one's a question. I think the irony of all this is that it started off as a Slav, Germanic, Teutonic, Russian discussion amongst Queen Victoria's grandchildren, and very quickly ended up to be a slogfest with France, England for many more years as the Eastern Front collapsed, which I think was kind of very ironic. But my question is, what's your opinion on where the guilt lies for this? Because, you know, many would put the blame squarely in France's lap. Because as Germany and Russia were seeking an accord over the Slavs and beginning to back off and not mobilise, the French mobilised. And it was the French mobilisation that caught the Kaiser by surprise, and he said, oh my God. And hence the Schuffen plan, and he decided the only way to deal with this is to attack France. Where do you put the guilt on all of this?
Well, I think where do I put the guilt on the war? I'd like to kind of turn it around the other way and sort of say, often on some of these occasions, the spark that starts the war is just no more than a spark. But lo and behold, countries then react. You know, I mean, just look at what's happened as recently with Iran, right? The shooting down of a drone. The President of the United States is faced like every ruler has been faced since the Roman times. Every ruler who has a big stick has faced with the question to use it or not use it. If you use it, where is the escalation going to go? If you don't use it, hey, am I seen as being weak? And what happened indeed was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, is that the Austro-Hungarian monarchy said that obviously this was a Serbian plot. And so Serbia had to be really dealt with very strongly and very vigorously. Well, Serbs are Slavs and Russians are Slavs. And so now the Schlieffen Plan, which was the military plan, which was already existed for Germany to move the war, if war ever started, to move into the Belgium and to the France area. And all it needed was that trigger. So I think my personal feeling, and having, when I was at the United Nations, I was involved in sitting often in the Security Council when things were being discussed, when issues became the Security Council. And it was so easy to see that countries, for their own sovereign national interests, which they have a right to, would, if not careful, would do something and feel that they have to respond, you know. And incidentally, retaliation by force is regarded as unlawful in international law. Now, countries that decide to do these things just sweep international law aside, but that's the way it is. So I'm afraid I've gone away from your question, but at the same time, that's my feeling about it. It's the unpredictable things, one after the other, click, click, click. I mean, when the war started in August 1914, most of the countries were at the races. They were at the yachting club. It was a beautiful summer. And lo and behold, nobody ever thought that they would be plunged into a war, and yet it all happened in 7 days. sort of, sorry, Marion, I'm coming here.
How did the Germans and where did they build their navy? They didn't have access, yet we had submarines in Long Island Sound.
Here are some. The German Navy, Germany had colonies in Africa. Germany, what later Tanzania, used to be Tanganyika, they had colonies in Africa. They had various interests abroad. They had some islands in the Pacific, and the Kaiser was particularly resentful of the British naval supremacy, and in order to protect and to defend their interests, and also show that Germany was equivalent and could be equivalent, started building in the early 1900s the dreadnought. And there was a big competition between the British and the Germans as they built battleships, one after the other. And so by the time, and a great port was established near Kiel called Wilhelmshaven, Wilhelm being the name of the Kaiser, all right? And the great naval port was built, and the high seas fleet, which was quite huge, was built deliberately to try to say the British naval supremacy, they'd been cock of the walk too long. Germany was, if it was to have a world presence, must have a world navy. The high seas fleet only came out once. There was the Battle of Jutland between the British Grand Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet in the North Sea in 1915. Both countries took great damage. Actually, the British ships were more damaged and sunk, some of them, than the German High Seas Fleet. But once that battle was over, the German High Seas Fleet went back to Wilhelmshaven and Kiel and never came out again. Germany was having huge success with unrestricted submarine warfare, but the surface ships didn't come out. And what happened at the end of the armistice was that it was agreed that the German Navy had not surrendered. The Germans had not surrendered. It was an armistice after all, and it was agreed that the surface fleet should be escorted to a neutral port and placed no ammunition, and should be placed there until a treaty was discussed. It was agreed. Sweden wouldn't have the German fleet, neither would Norway, and so it was agreed that they should go to Scapa Flow, which is up in the Orkneys, north of Scotland. There is a group of islands, the Orkneys and the Shetlands, and there's this great natural harbour, deep harbour, which had been the home of the British fleet during the war. So the German High Seas Fleet was escorted up, and there it is, part of it up there, the battleships and the destroyers and the cruisers. 20,000 German sailors took it up to Scapa Flow. Then most of the German sailors were sent home. But the problem was that the Bolsheviks and the Red Flag and they had got in amongst the crew, and the crew was basically they were mutinous. In fact, the German High Seas Fleet, the admirals had decided that on October the 30th, that is 12 days before the armistice was signed in 1918, that the High Seas Fleet would go out from Kiel and Wilhelmshaven and have one last fight with the British, and either it would win, in which case Germany would win the war, or if it lost, then at least they'd done the honourable thing. But in fact, they couldn't get the crews to take the ships out. And so in fact, the officers were disobeyed, and the crews would refuse to do it. The crews had established councils on board the ships, and where they would consider all the orders that the officers gave and decide whether the sailors would agree to them or not. Anyway, so there's the fleet. And then by the 21st of June, 1919, that is to say 7 days before the treaty was signed, the treaty, in fact, was expected to be signed on the 23rd. And by that time, they'd only got 4,000 sailors sitting in these ships. And they'd been sitting there for 6 months. 6 months? 5 months. And boy, were they bored. The British wouldn't allow them to go ashore. Not that there's anything to go ashore for in the whole for the Scarborough Flow, and wouldn't allow them to have mail from home, and kept an sight of them. And so what happened was that Admiral von Reuter, Rear Admiral von Reuter, had quietly talked amongst his officers and decided on a plan that they were not going to allow the treaty to give some of these ships to the British Navy and some of these ships to the French Navy and some of these ships to the Americans. No, they were going to do the honorable thing. Oh, incidentally, the British had said you are forbidden to fly the German naval flag. No, Admiral von Reuter said, no, when I give the signal, you will hoist, all our ships will hoist the German naval flag. You will then open the seacocks, open the portholes, and let the ships sink. And that's what happened. 52 warships sank to the bottom of the seabed, all on the 21st of June. Of the sailors who were left, they got in the lifeboats and they started rowing ashore. The British were totally surprised, weren't aware of this, didn't know what was going to happen. What would you do with 4,000 German sailors all of a sudden on the mainland, not mainland, the land, when in fact the total population was only about 250. And so unfortunately, 9 German sailors were shot by the British as they landed. And the ships gradually but steadily sank on the bottom. Some were beached and recovered because the British did have some guard ships at the time. But that is one of the German battleships, the Hindenburg, which sat on the bottom, and there's the water level. The total depth is about 150 feet in certain places, but not there, obviously. But even so, the depth. I mean, having been in the Royal Navy myself, that's probably 60 or 70 feet down to the bottom of the keel. And the German Navy. They were very proud of themselves, and they had a right to be proud. Just 4 days ago, a memorial service was held at the headstones of the 9 German sailors who were shot by the British and the Germans and the descendants of the 9 sailors who were shot, and poppies were laid on their grave. Sorry, long answer to your question.
What similarities do you see between the nationalism of Nazi Germany and Donald Trump's nationalism?
Why do you keep asking me these $64,000 questions? Well, I mean, what similarities do I see between the nationalism of Hitler and Germany and the nationalism of Donald Trump? I mean, every nation has a right to be proud of itself. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Every nation has a right to sovereignty. But on the other hand, if in fact that nationalism is used to overpower other interests, it seems to me one is on a very slippery slope indeed. Now, Donald Trump didn't like the deal done with Iran, which of course was signed by 5 other countries: the United States, Britain, France, Russia, China, and Germany. Those other 5 countries want to stick with it. The United States sort of says no, under President Trump, we're going to walk away from that deal. And furthermore, if any of you other 5 continue to deal commercially with Iran, then we shall apply sanctions against you, the British, the Germans, and of course Europe is faced with a problem. On the other hand, on the one hand, they want this agreement. It was never a treaty, incidentally. In order for it to be a treaty, it has to be ratified by the U.S. Senate And Obama knew very well there was no point in putting it to the US Senate. Therefore, it was only an agreement. You see, there's a big difference. So fundamentally, Britain and France and Germany particularly, less so Russia and China, but Britain, France and Germany have trading arrangements. They have NATO arrangements. They have security arrangements with America. On the one hand, they want the agreement to work, but on the other hand, they can't afford to piss America off. And at that stage, of course, the United States is actually, in my personal view, applying an unfair elbow twisting arising out of its net. Now, it's not in the same boat as Hitler. It really is not, absolutely not. But what I'm getting at is, in the general principle, to what extent does a country say, this is the way that I want things to be, and the rest of you better see it my way, or I'll thump you. And I don't think that's a way of doing it, international relations. But I mean, you know, other people will disagree, but I mean, that's the way that I sort of feel it anyway. Yes, sir.
I'd like to just share a story. I thought the talk was excellent. A neighbor of mine grew up in Germany and was a teenager when Hitler came to power. Remembers his first speech on the radio. Her father, who was a local businessman, not really political, absolutely hated the Nazis from the beginning. And he said, they're vulgar, they're going to get us in the war, they're going to destroy Germany. And then the war came. And he said, see, I knew this was going to happen, but then it was one victory after another. And then the father started picking up the paper, following Hitler. And then what he said was just a great event for them was the day France surrendered. Because they particularly hated the French and the Treaty of Versailles. And when Hitler came back for that big parade that they had, she said her father, who at one time hated the Nazis, all the men on the street where they lived in some little town put a swastika out in front of their house, and there was her father like everybody else. At the exact same moment, they gave the Nazi salute. And then the war starts to turn, and the Russians are coming from the east. They're being bombed, and then they find out about the concentration camps. At that time, again, you know, I was right, they were going to destroy the country. But the hatred that they felt towards the result of the Treaty of Versailles, and they particularly blamed France more than anyone. She said, make no mistake, on the day that France surrendered, every German was a Nazi.
There's no doubt about it. There's a long history between France, the enmity of France and Germany, France and Prussia as well. But at the same time, it has always seemed to me that when you're in a negotiation, countries are in a negotiation, and they're keen to achieve something, then they should always leave a hole in the wainscot for the mouse to escape. In other words, don't force a country into shame. If you force a country into shame and into embarrassment, then in fact the risk is that country will do something stupid that you don't want, and then what are you going to do? You have a big stick, do you use it or you not use it? The same is true with Iran at the moment. You know, don't force Iran into a situation from which they feel there is no escape. But that's the subject for a different talk.
For everybody that wants to get a sense of what Germany was like at that time, there is a wonderful Netflix TV series made in Germany called Babylon Berlin. And it really does give you a...
Yeah, Michael's talking about there's a very good series, it's on Netflix, I think it, isn't it? Called Babylon Berlin, and it's about Germany during the Weimar period, before Hitler actually emerged, but already this tussle that was going on, that Mark will talk about when he gives his talk about the Weimar Republic, the tussle between the Bolsheviks movement and the right-wing, the nationalist movement, and who was going to win. And Babylon Berlin is very well done. The Germans, I think they're just about to show the second series of that, and the Germans have spent, so I read, 20 million euros on this particular series. And you know, when you're in a country like Germany, again, they have a right to be proud of themselves. And lo and behold, they lost the First World War, they lost the Second World War. Having the embarrassment and the shame thrust down their throats is not wise politics. Now, I'm not saying that anyone's doing that at the moment, but really, you know, one has got to leave room and always respect your international opponent, and make sure you don't squeeze that opponent into a corner from which that opponent feels that there's no escape. You know.
They don't care. They won the Third World War with euros.
Yes.
Without firing a shot.
Yes, Michael's saying they won the Third World War with the EU and the Euro. And I always felt that why did Germany need a European currency? They already have one called the Deutschmark. You know. And anyway, you've been very good. Thank you very much indeed.